most people have at least some experience with the poetry of William Blake. Now, this experience tends to come from one or two places, we might say. The songs of innocence and of experience. These poems are wonderful in their own right, and many of them are world famous, let alone nationally famous. I'm specifically thinking of London. I wandered through the charted streets, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. And, of course, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, and so on. But this really doesn't touch on the great sage's prophetic work, or the fact that he came up with his own, let's call it, mystic theology. He wrote numerous of these illuminated manuscripts, including Jerusalem, Milton, where we actually get the hymn Jerusalem written down, albeit in a non-songful form, and the visions of the daughters of Albion. Now, because this information is so poorly disseminated, and there is so much to gain by it in a reading of Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which most people are going to take a look at anyway, I thought it was a good idea to combine the forms of visual media and voice into a series of videos which will, and forgive the pun, hopefully illuminate the illuminated manuscripts for modern readers, viewers, etc. Because they are a pain to go through when you don't understand what exactly Blake is going for. So I may interrupt and provide a few footnotes here or there, but overall the project is designed to be absorbed. And while some people like Harold Bloom and Northrop Frye like the idea of Blake having this singular conceit, this absolute set of allegories, he's really far more complicated than anyone can possibly understand fully. So I will, of course, acknowledge that there are some areas that I don't understand. But the basics of the theology go like this, and I say this before any of the subsequent uploads, which may or may not contradict me. Blake took from two main sources. One of them was Swedenborg, who was in favour of sexual liberation, and Swedenborg not only took from this secondary source himself, but Blake did as well, Gnosticism, the idea that the fall is an event precluded by a splitting off from the real. As in, we divide from Eden not only in the sense that we leave it, we're thrown out of it, but also we're split into strange and shadowy phenomena. Blake has numerous names for these emanations, as he calls them. But what is most important is that he suggests, from a fairly Unitarian perspective, that we all hail from a singular organism called Albion, who is the total absorption of humanity. We're all his fragments. But of course, before he goes through this main fragmentary stage, he splits up into four Zoas. Tirzah, Urizen, who is perceived as the kind of fake Gnostic god of our world, Tharmas, and let me just check what the other one's name is. Pardon. Luva. Now, these sub-gods, as we might call them, have positive and negative traits. Urizen is known as the ploughman. He's the intellect. He lives in the south. He's associated with the zenith. Luva is the emotional life, lives in the east or center. Tharmas is the life of the senses. He's known as the shepherd. He lives in the west. Thurna is inspiration, instinct, and he is known as the blacksmith. But of course, applying a singular gender identity to any of these characters is an intrinsically flawed operation, seeing as they contain both male and female. Now, in order to fall, the characters supposedly have to die. They have to exit eternity, which is this field of constant Dantesque movement that Blake sees as the highest state of reality. And when they fall or die or come into conflict with one another, they follow the path of ulro, which is a word that Blake uses synonymously with hell, and it means attributing good and evil to individuals instead of states. So resigning yourself from the collective eternity and breaking off into an individual struggle. And whenever this happens to one of the Zoas, who are themselves constituents of Albion, they develop female emanations, who are named, in correspondent terms to those I introduced earlier, Ahania, Vala, Anion, and Enetharmon. Now, if this wasn't complicated enough, parodying the Old Testament idea of Eve emerging from Adam's rib, it also fundamentally changes the composition of each of the Zoas, because they have, in a sense, excreted their female part and remain more constantly male as a result. And Blake sees this as a phenomenal evil, and I mean that both in the sense that it's a great evil and in the sense that it's an evil in phenomena, because it takes away the complicated multiplicity that is involved in eternal beings, who are full of movement and life and never become exasperated. Because, of course, falling in Blake's theology is a constant movement, rather than something that simply ends. It's nigh as constant as eternity, it would seem, while that is obviously a contradiction. Each of these emanations divide themselves. So specifically Vala, who is the subject of her own volume, or illuminated manuscript, is known as Tirzah, and also Rahab. And Tirzah is known as the lovely, Rahab is the apocalyptic. So she's rather like Shiva in that respect. Rahab is also associated with Babylon, luxury for its own sake, as opposed to following what I'll colloquially call the Schopenhauerian will. Now, Enetharmon, who is probably the most interesting out of all of these emanations, is the wife of Athona Los, who is himself, as I've said before, the Zoa of inspiration or instinct, the spirit of poetry, if you will. So he marries his own emanation, and he has four sons, Rintra, Palambron, Theotormon, and Bromion. And these also correspond back to the original four Zoas, Urizen, Luva, Tharmas, and Athona. And so redemption, if you will, seems to find its natural path through Athona Los, because, of course, he is beginning or repeating or circling back to the process that brought him about. Through him there's the hope of establishing Albion again. You may have noticed in all of this that Blake is also reiterating the idea of four over and over again. And he certainly does more of this as we go along. He maps onto the four Zoas the ideas of different parts of London, as well as different ideas of philosophy. So Urizen, Luva, Tharmas, Athona are seen to correspond in many of his poems to Northwood, Blackheath, Hounslow, and Finchley, but also to the states of creation, redemption, judgment, and mercy, as well as, and this is very key here, four atmospheres: Eden, Beulah, Ulro, and generation. Now, these are also states of imagination to Blake. If you're on the peak of your imaginative capacity, if you're following the path of Athona Los, you are going into Eden. And this means having a fourfold vision. A vision that sees all of the different potential possibilities of individual items, objects, worlds, etc. And it's also a lovely word because, of course, it contains fourfold and also the words are and old. It's fourfold in its own respect because it has four words inside of it. If you go down to Beulah, which is a kind of purgatory. Again, you're having a divine vision, but it's more of a threefold vision than a fourfold vision. It doesn't contain its own contradiction. It doesn't try and bring things back to Albion, where this state of eternal peace is that we see demonstrated or illustrated in Songs of Innocence. Then you have Ulro, which I've already said is this kind of divisive or dualistic way of looking at the world, and also a word that Blake uses synonymously with hell. And then at last you have generation, which is dividing yourself more, separating yourself from the oneness of eternity, and becoming this horrifically split organism. And this is why, when you look at smaller poems, even, like Let the Brothels of Paris Be Open, I think it's called, the villain, Big Nobo Daddy, as Blake parodically says of the Jehovah figure of the poem, is said to enjoy hanging, drawing and quartering, precisely because this splits people up from eternity, from any sense of absolute or total fulfillment, and prevents them from ever feeling as if they're in control of their own will. Hence why Blake also uses the term Newton's sleep to refer to this specific state. He did not like Newton. He thought he was a kind of modern Satan, while depicting him very beautifully in a variety of paintings. And as a result, he reduced things down to their total simplicity, to things that could simply be dismissed in one way or another, instead of encouraging discussion. Now, Isaiah Berlin has a really wonderful way of explaining something like this in his lecture series on the Romantics. He talks about Hamann, who was an extremely influential German philosopher, theologian. He was essentially a drunken madman for most of his life, and then he reformed his ways, and he had a remarkable improvement. He became a theological madman instead. And he wrote all these different manuscripts. He was a good friend of Goethe, and he lived next door to Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant came to him one day and said to him, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just take geometry and dismiss the entire thing, simply get rid of it?" And Hamann responded violently against this. He hated the idea of the science being dismissed, absolutely despised the eradication of the possibilities of knowledge. One can even imagine him having gone so far as to say, if science is going to provide absolute answers, we have to delete it. We have to get rid of it as quickly as possible, because it's precisely this state of eternal unknowing that generates a purpose and love for life, a mortal love for life that has an awareness of death. And that's precisely what Blake is going after as a mortalist himself, returning things to this primal or imaginative unity, without the mental or scientific divisions or discriminatory factors that are brought into practice. This furthermore happens to coincide with the way that Blake viewed the social situation. He was avidly in favour of women's rights. It's tougher to say on matters of race relations, but he was totally opposed to slavery. And as a result, next to America and Europe and Asia, he gives Africa its own prophetic book, which is something that I cannot imagine Wordsworth or Coleridge doing to the same capacity. But as a result, we end up with, to put it bluntly, a fourfold philosopher, not simply a poet. A character who is combining and soldering together totally divergent aspects of the social scene of his day in order to create beautiful works. But more importantly, beautiful works that follow the laws of Dante's banquet, of Dante's set of very specific poetic criteria that allow readings to be performed that have coherent sensibilities. The theology is the politics is the theology. You can't simply cut him apart. That would be doing the work of Urizen, after all. And for this reason, I think it is absolutely vital that we understand the uniqueness of the poet at hand. There is simply no one else like him that comes to mind, bar some of the original church fathers. And it is why it is such a shame to me, someone who, I suppose, barely understands Blake, but at least understands enough to admire him, that we simply cut up or perform surgery on his easier works and then deliver them to children. That there is so much more to be gained from a mature perspective, from simply going through the difficult additional details that come with some of his manuscripts. And this is what I intend to illuminate in some respect or other as we go through the different works that are coming up on this channel. Regardless, I hope this has been in some way informative. I'm just going to go and get a pizza. I'll see you around. Bye.